believe it is our responsibility to resist the injustices done by government in our names. We pledge to bring about freedom and peace. Another world is possible, and we pledge to make it real.
This is Anarchast.
Welcome to Anarchast. I'm super excited. My own personal hero is here with us today. I'm in Phoenix with Doug Casey at his very own Casey conference here. When Money Dies it's a perfectly named conference for a dollar vigilante like me, and I found Doug himself. And thank you very much for being on Anarchast with me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Jeff. I hope that the watchers won't mind my easy informality. I'm wearing my CIA shirt today. It's flowered, but anarchism is a gentle philosophy, so I think that it's good to wear a disarming flowered shirt, because most people expect anarchists to be bomb throwers stalking around with little round things with lit fuses. But often, to tell you the truth, I wear a suit and a coat and tie when I'm talking about anarchism, to show that anarchists can also be conservative looking and appear to be a member of the establishment. We aren't all hippies either.
Yeah, well, I'm wearing all black, so I guess I'm playing the role of the anarchist today. I just didn't wear my balaclava.
Well, we could show that we're men of many parts.
And so how have you been enjoying the show so far?
Well, this is a financial show, of course, and this is another misapprehension on the part of most people about anarchism, because as you know, there's two traditions of anarchism: basically the American tradition and the European tradition, which is mostly French and Russian, really. And people like Bakunin and Kropotkin, if you read their stuff about social things, they are totally sound. But it's like they have a bifurcated mind when it comes to anything to do with economics. And this is another problem with perceptions of economics on the part of the public. They somehow think that just because we want to get rid of the government, they think we want to overthrow the total social and economic order, when actually true anarchists are capitalists. They're not socialists by any means.
Yeah, it's been interesting for me. I'm a fairly new anarchist. You actually were the first person to tell me I was an anarchist and a libertarian. I didn't even know. I knew I'd heard the word anarchist, but I hadn't even heard the word libertarian until you told me one night at dinner in Vancouver. You said, "Oh, you're a libertarian," and I said, "What's that?" And I went home and spent many months just reading up on it. It
really does give hope for the future that somebody can do that. But you know, this is one thing that, on the one hand, it gives me hope for the future when you can react that way. But on the other hand, it makes me despair of the future. It makes me think that libertarianism and that way of thinking is actually a genetic mutation of some type, because there are some people that just don't understand it, no matter how you explain it, how logically. It's just like they can't overcome that psychological aberration. And I almost think it's genetic in the case of some people.
Yeah, I could definitely understand why you would feel that way. I've always just thought they've just been so heavily brainwashed that they just are not able to think that way. But hey, we might be different genetically.
Maybe people are starting to speciate on mental grounds at this point. It's possible. Anything's possible, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's very, very interesting concept. And so, let me ask you, how did you, when you were younger, I heard you lived in Washington, D.C., right in the belly of the beast, and I heard you even wanted to be a police officer at one point?
Well, I'll tell you how I started out. It was actually a conventional Pilgrim's Progress. I remember, this is the truth, when I was living in Chicago, actually, for a while, and we drove through the slums of Chicago, and this would have been in like 1953 or 54, and I remember this as clear as day. I was shocked at the, terrible conditions these black people were living in, and I don't know where the hell I got this idea, but I asked my mother, and she did it, to type a letter which I dictated to President Eisenhower saying, can you do something? So from my point of view, people that want the government to do something think the way maybe an intelligent 8-year-old would think with that degree of sophistication. But then as time went on, I grew in wisdom and grace. And I turned from being a liberal, which I was. I read Barry Goldwater's book, Conscience of a Conservative. And I said, oh, that's really more what I am. So then I considered myself a conservative with some reservations. And what would have been the next step? Oh, I know. I became an intellectual conservative after I started reading National Review of Bill Buckley when I was in college. And I despise Buckley now, of course. The next thing that happened to me, and probably the most important thing, was I read Ayn Rand's book, The Virtue of Selfishness. And I remember that totally clearly. After I read the first page of The Virtue of Selfishness, I had to put the book down because I couldn't believe that somebody had crystallized everything that I've been thinking my whole life. So,
the first page.
Just the first page, and of course I tore through the book. But it's a little bit of good news and bad news, because at that point I thought Rand was a genius. Of course she is a genius. And I became a Randite for a couple of years, which is not a good thing, of course. It's like joining a religious cult. But she's so right about almost everything. And then the next and in some ways final step of my evolution was when I read a book called The Market for Liberty by Morris Linda Tannehill. And at that point I realized that I was actually an anarchist. How old was I? I was on a treasure hunting expedition for 3 months, so I was 24 when I read that book.
Treasure hunting?
Yes. Yes.
There must be a story behind that.
No, it was wonderful. There were 30 of us that each paid $3,000 to go. We were going to do two things: dive for blockade runners off Charleston Harbor, and then go down to the Keynesianism banks off the coast of Colombia and look for sunken galleons. But in order to do this, we had to rebuild the boat. I mean, the management didn't tell us that. And so we had a minesweeper, just like Jacques Cousteau's minesweeper, except it wasn't just like Jacques Cousteau's minesweeper. Ours looked like a target drone. So we had to fix it up and paint it up. We had to do all this stuff. But we did, and it became seaworthy. And then we drove it down to Charleston, but we drove it down. By that time, it was too late in the season to effectively dive on the blockade runners, although I actually got onto one. I don't know what's happened to them since then. So I said, all right, let's go down to the Caribbean. But how badly organized was this? It was almost like a libertarian treasure hunt, because we were going down to the Keynesianism banks, and the reason why it was a graveyard for galleons is because there's lots of reefs everywhere that rise and fall. That's why the galleons got sunk, but we didn't even have lifeboats on that minesweeper, if you can believe that. It was registered as a yacht in Florida. You got this 135-foot boat with this tiny little yacht sticker on the front of it. It was wonderful from that point of view. But anyway, the thing finally got sunk off the Bahamas. I lost my money. So no.
You seem to have done okay since then. So.
Yeah, no. There's always a couple of false starts. But one of the problems with libertarians is that most of them are poor as church mice.
Why is that?
Well, I've thought about that actually. And it's a little bit like Marxists, like Karl Marx himself, because it's said that Mrs. Marx said to Karl, stop writing about capital and get some of it. It's supposed to be a true sentiment on her part. And that's the problem with libertarians. They think about money, they think about capital, they theorize about it, but they just don't put theory into practice. So most of them are poor as church mice, and it's a damn shame.
Yeah, I was starting this podcast, and I had heard that from a few people. They said, well, you're probably not going to make much money from this. And I wasn't planning to make money anyway, but they said that, and I said, why? And they said, well, most anarchists are pretty broke. They don't have money. And I never really, I just didn't understand that because, well, there's some anarchists here, including yourself, who have made a lot of money, but to me, anarchy is about free markets and capitalism and that sort of a thing. And how are they just missing? I just really don't understand. But I did interview a young man named Seth King, who runs dailyAnarchist.com. And he moved to the Free State, New Hampshire. And he's a younger guy, so he was giving me the perspective of the younger people, the younger anarchists. And he says, and this I can totally understand and believe. He says with all this regulation and taxes and everything now, it's very hard to get going if you don't have much capital, because you can't just start a company in the U.S. with nothing anymore. You need licenses and so what he was telling me is that he's moving to the Free State, and he's going to basically do everything he can to avoid the state and to basically live in black markets and things like that to try to make money. And so possibly it's something to do with that maybe the younger guys, or was that the case when you were younger? Was it still the same then?
It's always been that way, of course, but it was much less that way in those days. I mean, the government was definitely there and was definitely a nuisance, but it just wasn't as invasive as it is today. Everything the government does is so much more costly. I remember I'll give you an example. Not that I want to come across as a scofflaw, but when I was living in Washington, D.C., if you parked your car illegally, it was a $2 ticket. Well, $2 was worth more then than it is now, but still, today you park your car illegally and you're probably looking in D.C. at a $40 or $50 ticket, and it'll start compounding weekly and so forth. So everything the state does is more intrusive and more costly now than it was then. There's more employees, they have more powerful computers, they're more desperate because they're closer to bankruptcy. But that's funny, because in my speech here at this conference, one of the things I talked about was the impending bankruptcy of the U.S. government, because it's actually on the ragged edge of financial collapse at this point. And it occurred to me that, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, yes, it should be a good thing that they go bankrupt, because maybe they'll just dry up and blow away if they're bankrupt. But then I thought, actually, no, it's extremely dangerous, because the most important thing for the state is self-preservation. And if they're bankrupt, they're not going to fire the army, the police, all the rest of these things. It'll be chaotic in society if the government goes bankrupt, because the first thing they do, of course, is they cut so-called essential services, things that they've co-opted from the free market. That's the first thing that they cut. So that then everybody says, do something, do something. And so the next stage in the United States is probably a dictator. So while the bankruptcy of the government should theoretically be a good thing, it's probably going to be the kind of thing that happened in France in 1789 when Louis XVI went bankrupt. That was a good thing. Glad to get rid of him. But then they got something worse because of the chaos that followed after that, and then something even worse in the form of Napoleon. And I fear that is the direction things are going in the U.S.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. Hopefully it doesn't work out too poorly. I have some hope, thanks to things like the internet, that maybe people will smarten up at some point and figure things out. But yeah, no one really knows what's going to happen, and it definitely, the transition from this nation-state government sort of a system to something better will be definitely in interesting times ahead. And sorry, I just need to cut you off. We're running out of time, so we'll just go to the next segment now.
I'm flies when you're having fun.
So we'll be right back. We're back again with Doug Casey, and one of the big things that I always think about is, well, I don't know how I would even live nowadays without the internet. And that's actually one of the things, people ask me what would actually make me take to the streets and actually start killing government people. If they turn off the internet, that's my line in the sand. I'm always amazed at people who did amazing things before the internet, because you know the internet today and how amazing it is. How did you do all these things in your life before the internet? How did you even find out about all the stuff you knew about?
Well, it had to be the printed word, of course. And I love the internet. It's the greatest thing since Gutenberg. Gutenberg invented movable type. It's just fantastic. It's this quantum leap forward, just like the printing of books was after Gutenberg. Although I've got mixed feelings about it. It's always a double-edged sword with technology. And what you can find on the internet is everything in all the world's libraries, and you can reach out one way or another to almost all the people in the world at this point. So that means I spend entirely too damn much time on my computer, which I don't like. And I personally like the experience of reading a book where I can flip the pages. I don't want to sound like a dinosaur. You're supposed to use a Kindle, of course, now. But it was writing a book. And of course, I wrote my first book. It was The International Man. And I wrote that book in 1975. And my friend Bob Kephart, who owned something called the Inflation Survival Letter, then published it in 1976. And when I was traveling to Rhodesia a bit later, 77, 78, anyway, it was about 78 in Rhodesia, which was in the middle of the war. And so how do you get the word out before the internet? I guess I'm speaking to that a little bit indirectly. So I was in Salisbury, which is now Harare, and I did what I always did in those days when I was in a new city. I would open up the yellow pages of the phone book. They don't have those anymore either, of course. And I would page through looking at different businesses and categories and so forth. And I thought, well, publishers. I just had a book published. I found 2 publishers, believe it or not, in Rhodesia at that time. Rhodesia was a different place. There were 250,000 Europeans there then. Now there's only a couple thousand. They've all made the chicken run, as they called it. I interviewed both of the guys, told them about my book, got along with one of them, he published it, and I had the largest selling book in the history of Rhodesia. And I became quite a personality in Rhodesia, doing television and radio and newspaper interviews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's wonderful, but that's how you do it back then. Now, I mean, Borders has gone bankrupt, and so it's a different world. It's a different world. But you know, I'll tell you what concerns me about the internet, Jeff. It's that I like to play poker, and I know you do too. But in the United States, there are millions of people that like to play the occasional game of online poker. And several months ago, the U.S. government just shut down all online gambling sites, the way the Chinese government might do or something else, and there wasn't a peep from anybody. Not from the media, no, God forbid from the media, not from any of the poker players. America's turned into a country of whipped dogs. It's very disturbing.
Yeah, I think, you know, they're so brainwashed nowadays, you know, from the schools. You know, Vladimir Lenin said that give me a child for 4 years and the seed I will plant will never be uprooted. Now they got them for 12 or 16, or if they get a master's or doctorate, 20 years of indoctrination. And they're subtly always saying socialist things, pro-state things, you know, anything to do with history is obviously, they just focus on, you know, all
the government. What's the government done?
That's right.
What the rulers have done.
Yeah, and then you have the media on top of that. So all these people go to these schools and they're in there every day, 8 hours a day, and following their orders and memorizing what the government tells them to do. Then they go home and they turn on the TV, and the TV's all just propaganda as well. So these people are so brainwashed at this point that it's really just...
Well, I must have gotten that stupid idea to write President Eisenhower from some influence back then. I mean, so yes, of course.
Yeah, when I was younger, this is a funny story, I wanted to be Prime Minister of Canada. So we all have sort of, you know, when we're younger, we're kind of stupid.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we'd really rather not admit it, but for the sake of honesty, we have to come across and say yes.
But I do tell people that because I don't get really angry with younger people who believe in the state and believe in all that stuff, because I do understand, because they don't have the experience, they haven't, because it does sound good, right? And that's the problem. All that stuff sounds good, socialism.
Sounds like a magic cornucopia that you can just access and make everything's better,
That's
yeah.
Right. But when you actually try to, or you see what happens in the real world, and it obviously never works out, is hundreds of millions of people who have been killed by communism have found out, but they never give up on it. At what point do you say, okay, hundreds of millions of people have died, you know, why do they keep trying to do it? Even this whole Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, they're against greed.
Against greed, right? Against capitalism.
That's right.
Now I hate Wall Street because it's totally corrupt,
yes.
but it's not for the reasons that they're doing it. But you know, in the milieu that I move in, which is like at our conference here, these are all rich people. These are, some of them are quite wealthy. I mean, there's several billionaires at our conference here. But I try to be very overt about these things. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to be too subtle anymore. So what I told these people yesterday is, look, there's lots of problems in the world, lots of things are going wrong, but you've got to get to the root of this thing, and that's the state. All the problems in the economy and society, they're driven by the state. So what you really have to acknowledge to yourself is it's the problem, it's your enemy. And the big question is, do you hate the state or not? You've got to ask yourself that question. And if you don't hate the state, then you may just be psychologically bent.
Yeah, I just wrote in my newsletter the other day about Keynesianism. You know, they keep trying this Keynesianism for decades now, and it always ends up in ruin. And I said in my newsletter that at this point we have to just assume that Keynesianism isn't just an economic school of thought. It's a serious form of brain damage.
Yes.
Like, how can you keep doing the same things over and over? They have the same completely predictable results.
I read these editorials by Nobel Prize winners, and of course it's completely meaningless. It's a
Barack Obama Peace Prize.
Yeah, exactly. It's a random popularity contest of some type by Stiglitz and Krugman, and these people, I actually think they're stupid. Well, they're certainly either knaves or fools, or probably both. Very, very. It really does tend to make me cynical and pessimistic for the future, saying that's. But on the other hand, there's lots of cause for optimism. I don't know.
I believe so. Thanks to the internet again. If it wasn't for the internet, I'd just give up on this and I'd just go live in the hills and just, try to enjoy my life and just try to ignore it as best as I could.
Well, that's what I'm doing, as you know. I mean, you know this, but I don't want to live in the hills like a monk, although, frankly, from a psychological point of view, I admire Zen monks, because it's rather odd. The older I get and the more I have, the less I feel I need or want. But I've basically moved to our community in Argentina because I want to watch all this on my widescreen for entertainment. I don't want to have it happen outside my front window, which could be very inconvenient.
Yes, it would be. Yeah, thinking about the future, do you have any thoughts about just the last few years? Have you anything about Ron Paul, perhaps, or any of that sort of stuff?
Well, I've known Ron for many years, and I used to put a conference on in Aspen called the Eris Society, and Ron often used to come to the conference. He's a decent human being. He's sound. I really like him personally. But his running for presidency is strictly of value from an educational point of view, because he can say some things that are different from what those other buffoons are saying. And let me accept Gary Johnson, who's kind of like Ron Paul Light, and I think is also a good guy. But the chances of his being elected president are slim and none, and Slim's out of town, although anything could happen. But even if he was elected president, even if he was, I am absolutely convinced that he would get a visit from the guys that run these Praetorian agencies, and they would lay down the law, and his life would be at risk.
I love that Bill Hicks bit, you probably know it, where he says if a president ever did something like Ron Paul, he'd be called into the very first day he gets elected, he'd be called into the back room, and a bunch of guys would come in black suits, and they'd put on a projector, and they'd show the JFK assassination from an angle you've never seen before. That was Bill Hicks. He was a great guy. That's very funny. That's very funny. Well, I like listening to George Carlin, who was a genius, and you introduced me to Doug Stanhope, who's like a George Carlin replacement, which the world sorely needs. Yes, definitely. Do you, in that line of thought, do you, because we used to have a lot of great thinkers, Murray Rothbard, Ayn Rand, and all that. Yeah. Do you see any new sort of people coming up? Or we don't seem to have a lot of the big names like that at the moment. You're one of the biggest. Lou Rockwell, who I interviewed the other day. I guess Ron Paul you could even throw in there, just because he's helping to educate people along those lines.
Well, you know, I am gratified by the fact that back in the days when I was in my 20s, I was the only kid on the block that I knew that thought like an anarchist. Now there are a lot of guys, and it seems like they're becoming to be more among the younger generation. So even if you start from a base of 2, if it doubles and doubles and doubles again, by the time it doubles to the 64th power, it's, you know, more atoms that are in the universe or something like that. But I'm afraid that it won't double at that rate, because, like I said, I'm coming to the conclusion that although, according to Pareto's law, the 80-20 rule, I'd say my view is that 80% of people are basically decent, get along, go along, libertarian-oriented human beings. But that's just kind of in general. I think that we're a genetic mutation.
So do we have to go live together and
Well, that's why that's one reason why I'm so pro space colonization. We got to get off of this planet. It's entirely too small, too cramped, with too many sociopaths running around making life miserable for the rest of us whenever they can.
What do you think of seasteading?
It's a good idea, but it's capital intensive. That's why we need more libertarian billionaires.
Well, I wish we had more time. We're running out of time, and I'm so thrilled to have you on. And you're going to be in Argentina next month, as I will be as well. And hopefully we can have a glass of wine in the vineyards and do this again.
We'll have a cigar, some wine, joke, jive, socialize, low dope, snort coke, and practice your stroke.
And there, a lot of that's legal, so we can actually do it. So we can enjoy ourselves here. If we tried to bring a glass of wine out here, we'd be arrested pretty quickly. So.
Well, in Argentina, you can chew coca leaves, and it's quite socially accepted and very pleasant, actually.
Yeah, I'm going to have to try that when I go down. Well, thank you very much, Doug.
Okay, Jeff.
And we'll talk to you in about a month. Thank you. And peace, love, and anarchy.